17th of November 2018. Two men are dragging a dead body across a beach by a rope tied around its neck, and the fishermen, watching through binoculars, know better than to go any closer. The body belongs to John Allen Chau, a 26-year-old American. He is not the first outsider this stretch of sand has killed, and despite a law, a navy, and one of the most aggressive exclusion zones on the planet, he will not be the last. There is exactly one place on Earth where a sovereign government will send an armed patrol boat to stop you from setting foot on its own territory. Not to guard a military secret, not to protect a nuclear site, but to protect somewhere in the region of 150 people who have never been formally introduced to the rest of the human race. It's called North Sentinel Island. Get caught within 3 nautical miles of it, and Indian law can put you in prison for up to 5 years. Get onto the beach itself, and the people who live there have spent over a century and a half making it violently clear exactly what they think of visitors. North Sentinel sits in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, an Indian archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, roughly 30 miles from Port Blair, the territorial capital, and well over 1,000 miles from the Indian mainland, closer on a map to Myanmar and Indonesia than to Delhi. It's a small island about the size of Manhattan, ringed by a coral reef that makes it almost impossible to approach in anything bigger than a small boat, and covered edge to edge in dense tropical forest that no outsider has ever surveyed on foot. Nobody knows what's 50 meters past the tree line. Nobody has ever been allowed to find out. The people who live inside that tree line are called the Sentinelese, a name given to them by the outside world because nobody has ever gotten close enough for long enough to ask what they call themselves. Genetic and archaeological research suggests they descend from some of the earliest modern humans to leave Africa, arriving in the Andaman chain tens of thousands of years ago and staying there essentially undisturbed ever since. Their language has never been recorded by a linguist. Not one word of it exists in any dictionary, on any recording, in any research paper, anywhere. Even the neighboring Onga and Jarawa peoples, who share the same island chain and a distant ancestry, can't understand a syllable of it. What we do know about daily life on North Sentinel comes from a handful of long-range observations and a few scattered artifacts left behind. They live in small, lean-to shelters and larger communal huts, hunt with bows and iron-tipped arrows, spearfish in the shallow lagoon, and paddle narrow outrigger canoes that can't survive open water. One reason, alongside the reef, the Sentinelese have never left their own island in living memory. On one expedition, a search party found a human skeleton on the island, positioned sitting upright inside a large bucket hidden among the roots of a tree. The only real clue anyone has ever gotten about how they treat their dead. Beyond that, nothing. No outsider has ever had a real conversation with a Sentinelese person, if conversation is even the right word for two groups who don't share a single word of language. This isn't a tourist restriction, the kind you'd find around a nesting ground or a ruin. It's backed by a law with real teeth, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes Regulation, first passed in 1956 and reinforced since by additional wildlife and tribal protection statutes. Cross into the reserve without authorization, Indian citizen or foreign national, and it makes no difference. You're looking at years in prison, assuming you survive the crossing at all. The Indian Navy and Coast Guard patrol the water, and the exclusion zone isn't really there to keep the Sentinelers in. It's there to keep the rest of us out, for their protection and for ours. To understand why, you have to go back to the first time the outside world properly met them, in the summer of 1867. An Indian merchant vessel called the Nineveh wrecked on the reef surrounding the island, and its 86 passengers and 20 crew swam and waded ashore onto the one beach in the world you did not want to be shipwrecked on. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third, the Sentinelese attacked with iron-tipped arrows. The survivors fought them off with sticks and stones until a Royal Navy ship arrived to take them home. It was the first time in the historical record that anyone had written down what these people looked like, armed and unmistakably unwilling to be found. 13 years later, the British decided to find out more, whether the Sentinelese wanted them to or not. In January of 1880, a young naval officer named Maurice Vidal Portman led an armed landing party. Sailors, convict laborers from the Andaman Penal Colony, and trackers from other Andamanese groups already under British control. Onto North Sentinel. They found the villages empty, the Sentinelese had seen them coming and fled into the interior, all except for one elderly couple and 4 children who hadn't moved fast enough. Portman's men seized all 6 and took them back to Port Blair as living specimens. Within days, every one of them was seriously ill. The elderly couple died first. A few weeks later, Portman sent the 4 children back to the island, still sick, loaded down with gifts as a kind of apology. Nobody recorded exactly what illness they were carrying, and nobody knows for certain what happened once they reached the beach. But some historians think that return trip, not folklore, is the real root of Sentinelese hostility toward outsiders, a documented first-hand lesson in exactly what contact costs delivered within the space of a single month. For most of the next century, North Sentinel was left alone, not out of respect, but because nobody found it worth the trouble. That changed after Indian independence, when an anthropologist named Trilok Nath Pandit made his first landing on the island in 1967, almost exactly 100 years after the Nineveh went down. Pandit found the same thing Portman had: abandoned huts, cooking fires still smouldering, and no people in sight. Over the next 2.5 decades, he kept coming back, using a method that was patient to the point of strangeness: sail close to shore, unload coconuts, cloth, plastic buckets, and iron tools into the shallows, then retreat and wait, sometimes for months, to see whether the gifts were taken. Coconuts don't grow naturally on North Sentinel, which made everyone Pandit left behind a kind of calling card the Sentinelese couldn't get anywhere else. The results were unpredictable and sometimes violent. In 1974, a film crew accompanying one of Pandit's expeditions got close enough that the Sentinelese opened fire for real. An arrow struck the director in the thigh in what became one of the first photographs the outside world ever got of the tribe armed and mid-attack. 7 years later, in August of 1981, a cargo ship called the MV Primrose ran aground on the reef in a storm, and its crew watched from the deck as armed Sentinelese gathered in canoes, clearly preparing to board. The crew stayed locked below for nearly a week, radioing for help until a helicopter working an oil contract finally lifted them clear. The Sentinelese never got aboard the ship, but they got the wreck. It sat rusting on the reef for years afterward, and the tribe stripped it for metal, hammering salvaged iron into arrowheads and tools. Parts of the hull are still visible in satellite images of the island today. Then, on the 4th of January 1991, something genuinely unprecedented happened. A group of Sentinelese walked out of the tree line and waded unarmed into the water to meet Pandit's boat, taking coconuts directly from his hands. 7 weeks later, on the 21st of February, it happened again. The Sentinelese boarded the visitors' boats and accepted gifts hand to hand, then melted back into the forest. To everyone involved, it looked like the beginning of something. It wasn't. Over the following years, Indian anthropologists noticed the Sentinelese starting to wait on the beach for the boats, expecting the coconuts, anticipating the visits. And that pattern, dependency, was exactly what had preceded catastrophe for every other Andamanese group the British and later the Indian government had ever made sustained contact with. The great Andamanese population had collapsed by roughly 99% after contact. The Yongja had lost around 85% of theirs. A third group, the Jangil, had been wiped out completely. Faced with that history and a tribe that seemed to be edging toward the exact relationship that had ended everyone else, the Indian government did something almost unheard of in the history of contact with isolated peoples. In 1996, after nearly 30 years of trying to build a friendship, it simply stopped. The gift-dropping missions ended. The exclusion zone hardened into the one that still stands today. The policy became 4 words that still guide every patrol boat in that stretch of water: eyes on, hands off. The next confirmed sighting of the Sentinelese came under the worst possible circumstances. On the 26th of December 2004, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake off Sumatra triggered the Indian Ocean tsunami, one of the deadliest natural disasters on record, and North Sentinel sat close to the epicenter. Indian officials feared the worst for a population with no infrastructure and nowhere to run. Days later, a Coast Guard helicopter flew low over the island to check for survivors, and what the crew found became one of the most reproduced images connected to the tribe. A single Sentinelese man standing on the beach, aiming a bow straight up at the aircraft. The island had actually been lifted out of the water by the earthquake, exposing new reef. The tribe had survived, and their answer to a helicopter checking on their welfare was the same answer they gave everyone else: leave. 2 years later, in January of 2006, the exclusion zone claimed two of its own. Sundaraj, 48, and Pandit Tiwari, 52, were fishermen who'd gone looking for mud crab in the waters around the island, a catch that pays well and happens to be illegal to take from a protected tribal reserve. They anchored overnight to sleep. At some point before dawn, the anchor slipped and the current carried their boat onto the beach while they were still aboard, asleep. Neither of them ever fished again. When a Coast Guard helicopter went in afterward to try to recover the bodies, it was driven back by arrows before it could land. Nobody was ever prosecuted for the deaths of Sundaraj and Pandit Tiwari, because prosecuting the case would have meant sending investigators onto the same beach that killed them. Which brings the story back to John Allen Chau. He grew up in Alabama, studied at Oral Roberts University, and had spent years, by his own account, preparing to bring Christianity specifically to the Sentinelese, inspired by stories of missionaries who'd made contact with other isolated peoples. He knew exactly how dangerous North Sentinel was. He'd read the accounts of the 2006 killings, and he put himself through an 11-day self-imposed quarantine before the trip specifically so that he wouldn't be the one to carry in a disease that could wipe the tribe out. He paid a group of fishermen to get him near the island in October and November of 2018. On the 15th of November, he made his first real attempt paddling a kayak to the beach, calling out a greeting, holding up gifts. A young Sentinelese boy fired an arrow that went straight through the Bible he was carrying. He fled back to the boat. In the journal he left with the fisherman, he wrote about being frightened and about deciding to go back anyway. On the 16th, he asked the fisherman to drop him near the shore and take the boat away entirely, reasoning that the Sentinelese might feel less threatened without it sitting offshore. It was his last entry. The fisherman returned the following morning and saw, from a distance, what looked like Chau's body being buried on the beach. Indian police arrested 7 fishermen for helping smuggle him into the reserve and opened a case for culpable homicide against people who, technically, could never be identified or produced in a courtroom, because charging them would mean sending police onto that same beach. The case has never gone anywhere. It's unlikely it ever will. You'd assume a story like Chau's would be the last word on North Sentinel. It wasn't. In March of 2025, an American YouTuber named Mikhailo Viktorovich Polyakov, who filmed himself in restricted places under the channel name Neo-Orientalist, sailed a small inflatable dinghy toward the island after, by his own account, spending weeks studying tide patterns and the Coast Guard's rough patrol movements. He landed on the 29th of March, blew a whistle on the beach for close to an hour trying to draw the Sentinelese out, and when nobody appeared, left a can of Diet Coke and a coconut in the sand, filmed the whole thing on a GoPro, and sailed back to the mainland. He was arrested 2 days later after a local fisherman reported him. Indian prosecutors charged him with entering a protected tribal reserve, a crime carrying up to 5 years in prison. His bail was denied and his custody kept getting extended month after month, while human rights groups pointed out that a can of soft drink is a genuine biohazard to a population with no immunity to anything the rest of us carry without thinking about it. Then, in May of 2026, the case ended, not with 5 years, but with a fine of roughly $160. Weeks after that, Polyakov uploaded the footage from his trip to his channel anyway, despite a court order to hand it over. That's where things stand today. Nobody knows exactly how many Sentinelese are alive because you cannot run a census on people who will meet you with arrows. The figures that get quoted range from as few as 15 to as many as several hundred. Most recent estimates, built from aerial surveys and the size of the camps visible from a careful distance, land somewhere around 150. They're formally classified by the Indian government as a particularly vulnerable tribal group, one of a handful of communities across the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, alongside the Jarawa and the Shompen, living in some degree of voluntary isolation, though none as completely or as fiercely as the Sentinelese. Satellite and mapping companies keep their imagery of the island at deliberately low resolution, and patrol boats still circle at a distance a few times a year to confirm from far off that the smoke is still rising from the cooking fires and the beaches don't look abandoned. Nothing more than that is attempted or allowed. Here's what nobody can tell you, no matter how long they've studied this place. We don't know what the Sentinelese call themselves. We don't know what they call their own island or what they call us. We don't know what they believe happens to a person after a death like the ones on that beach, or what they made of a helicopter, a satellite, a GoPro, or a can of Diet Coke landing in their sand. Every other people in history who tried to stay this separate from everyone else eventually got pulled in, by disease, by war, by the plain economic gravity of the modern world. So far, the Sentinelese are the exception, and the method they've used to stay that way is the one thing about them the rest of us understand perfectly. Whether that holds is a question nobody outside that tree line can answer, and for a people who've spent a century and a half making their answer as clear as physically possible, that not knowing might be exactly how they want it to stay.